Hello everybody. Hi friends. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, I have not posted in a minute. It's been a couple weeks. And I will just have to catch you guys up in another video. I've just been living, you know. I have just been really busy. I'm wearing my Big Time Rush t-shirt from the Forever Tour. I literally went to their concert last night with my fiance and a couple friends, and it was so much fun, like so much fun. It was so nostalgic, and they're the cutest. My fiance has like always loved them, and she knows like all the words to every single one of their songs. Anyway, that is not what this video is about. If you hear my dogs pacing back and forth with their little claws on the floor, like right there, they just like to be at my butt, and I locked them out, so they're upset with me. But in tonight's video, I am going to be reading some spooky stories to you guys. I'm actually going to be reading some from this book called Small Horrors by Darcy Coates. I think is how you say her last name, Coates. It's just a book full of spooky, pretty short stories. And I'm just going to be reading you a few that stuck out to me that I really enjoyed. And I hope you enjoyed too. And I will just go ahead and jump right in. The first story I'll be reading you is called Hazard Lights. Maria leaned against the car door and stared through the window at the harsh white lights spaced along the Lane Cove tunnel. The driver kept trying to start a conversation, but she'd caught a red-eye flight and was beyond exhausted. All she wanted to do was get to her hotel and sleep for a lifetime. The traffic wasn't cooperating, though. It had been gridlocked for the last 20 minutes, and in the tunnel it seemed even worse. Maria didn't think they'd moved more than 10 meters in the last 5 minutes. Bad traffic today, yeah. The taxi driver, a cheerful man with a thick black beard, beamed at her in the rear vision mirror, and Maria mustered a thin smile. Haven't seen it this bad in months. Must be a breakdown ahead. Maria turned to look out of the opposite window, where she could see 5 other car lanes, 2 more going in their direction, and the other 3 going the opposite, all forced to a halt. Every now and then a car would crawl a few inches closer to its leader, as though that would make any sort of difference. The radio came to life with a crackle, and Maria jumped. She'd nearly fallen asleep. "We are currently experiencing an emergency situation," the voice on the radio said, and Maria leaned forward to listen to it. Her driver hadn't touched the radio. She knew by the way his face had gone pale. However, because the tunnel dipped below ground to carry cars from one side of the harbor to the other, the control room had the ability to activate the car's radios in an emergency. "Remain in your vehicle," the voice said. He sounded flustered and panicky, though he was clearly reading from a script. "Extinguish all lights and remain silent. Assistance will be sent as soon as possible." The radio fell silent. Maria looked to her taxi driver, whose face had lost almost all color. He turned the key in the ignition, powering the car down and killing its lights. Around her, other cars were also being turned swiveled in her seat to look behind her. She thought she could hear noises coming from deeper in the tunnel. Then the multitude of lights spaced along the concrete walls whined and died, plunging them into darkness. Someone shrieked, and car doors slammed. A handful of headlights were still on, and Maria tried to see what was happening through the limited glow. But everything was a mess of shadows and shapes. The radio crackled for a second time, and the voice returned. Its panic had risen to a nearly hysterical pitch, and he didn't seem to be reading from a script any longer. They say you should remain in your cars, but they're still finding you. Don't run. Don't bother. They'll catch you. They're spreading so fast. I've never seen or heard of anything like this before. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Stay in your cars. Stay. The voice broke off with a gasp, and Maria heard a banging noise in the distance, followed by what sounded like metal being twisted and torn. The radio clicked off. Maria sat frozen in her seat as she stared at her driver. A car a few rows ahead turned on its hazard lights, and the flashing red reflected off the driver's face as he stared back. Then the screams started. Maria turned to look behind them and saw shapes, people, running between the cars. It was more than panic. It was pandemonium. Several figures shoved against her taxi as they ran past, making its way. Maria placed one hand on the car door, preparing to exit and join the crowd, but she stopped when she caught sight of other, larger shapes farther back in the tunnel. They were barely visible in the blinking hazard light, but they were definitely not human. The shapes moved on all fours, dexterously climbing over the cars and scuttling along the tunnel's walls. Their limbs had at least 4 joints each, and they were larger than an average man. They snatched up the fleeing humans so quickly that the motions were a blur. Maria heard the crackles and snaps of breaking bones underneath their screams. Glass smashed as the creatures pounded through car windows. "Get down," the taxi driver hissed, shoving Maria out of her seat so that she was kneeling in the footwell. She flattened herself as much as she could, trying to breathe through her mouth to minimize the noise. The taxi driver sunk back into his seat, his eyes wide as he tried not to shake. From her position, Maria could still see the figures racing past the windows and feel the impact as they bumped into the car. Then the taxi shuddered as something large and heavy landed on it, and one of the running figures by her window was pulled from view with a gurgling shriek. Maria pressed her hand over her mouth and held her breath. They were enveloped by silence for a second, and then there was a horrific crash as the windshield was broken by a long, tough limb. The taxi driver barely managed to have a scream before he was torn out of his seat and pulled through the hole in the windshield. His voice choked off then, and dark liquid splashed across the window above Maria. The sounds were changing as screams faded into the distance. The human cacophony was replaced by steady, loud thuds as the creatures climbed over the cars, making snapping noises and chewing, tearing sounds. Maria squeezed her eyes closed so she wouldn't have to watch the shadows move past the windows. She kept still until the noises died into the distance and went eventually entirely extinguished. Her muscles ached from the cramped position. Outside the tunnel remained dark except for the hazard lights, which continued to bathe the area in intermittent flashes of red. She was surrounded in near-perfect silence, no footsteps, voices, thudding limbs, or tearing flesh. Maria shook as she slowly, cautiously rose to her knees. She peeked through the car's window, between the streaks of blood, to see that the tunnel seemed empty. So did the cars. Their human occupants had been stripped from them, pulling through broken windows or holes that had been carved in the metal. Maria alone had been spared, thanks to her hiding place. "I've got to leave before these creatures come back. There should be emergency exits placed along the walls. They should be too small for those things to fit through easily. If I can just get as a dozen pairs of reflective, globe-like eyes turned towards her. Okay. The next one I have here is called The Resident. Allie shifted the crowbar to her left hand as she glanced up and down the length of the plywood boards covering the space below her home. The crawl space had been boarded up since before Allie bought the property. The real estate agent had said it would make an excellent storage space, though, and with another 5 months until the weather would be warm enough to work in her garden, Allie figured she might as well put the storage space to use and clear up her yard. Allie approached one of the plywood boards and pressed the tip of her crowbar into the narrow gap above it. The wood had discolored from years of exposure to the weather, but it had held up surprisingly well. It groaned, creaked, and cracked as Allie forced the gap wider. Then it broke free with a loud snap. She pulled the board away and threw it aside, leaving a 2-foot opening in the crawl space. She dropped the crowbar and picked up the flashlight she'd set on the porch. Allie angled the harsh white beams into the space below. It was larger than she expected. While only a 3-foot high gap was visible from the outside, the ground dipped just past the entrance, creating nearly enough room for a person to stand upright. It was hard to see with only a small circle of light, but there seemed to be items already stored in the space below her home. She saw something that looked like a broken chair, as well as a pile of bags nestled into the corner. The house's support pillars blocked much of her view, and Allie, with a final glance at the garden, lowered herself into the crawl space. It was a tight fit through the plywood hole, but just beyond, the ground dropped away, and she was able to move forward when she crouched. The air was much cooler than outside. A smell, dirty, musty, and decayed, hung in the air. Allie pressed her sleeve over her nose to block out the stench and moved toward the plastic bags. They were all sealed, but several had split down the side. They looked as though they were filled with garbage. Did the previous owners seriously just leave their trash down here? Allie poked out one of the split bags with her foot, and rags fell out. They looked as if they had once been clothes, but had been worn down until holes developed and seams broke, making them unwearable. Under the clothes were broken plates and cups and bent cutlery. A quiet scratching noise disturbed her, and Allie turned in time to see a rat scamper out of her flashlight beam to hide behind a mattress. Allie approached the lumpy shape, trying to breathe through her mouth as much as possible. The mattress had broken down, and several of its springs poked out through the fabric. But strangely enough, someone seemed to have patched it with rags, similar to the ones in the bags. It was pressed against one of the support pillars, which had hid it from view of Allie's hole in the plywood. Beyond the mattress, a handmade shelf stood propped against the wall. Allie moved toward it and jumped as her foot hit something, sending it clattering across the dirt. She turned the flashlight down and saw empty cans, dozens of them, littering the ground. A voice in the back of Allie's head was telling her to get out, and get out fast, but curiosity compelled her toward the shelf. She casted her light over the odd collection arranged on the wooden boards: a plate, a cup, a spoon, a fork, and a knife. Next to them sat 2 candle stubs, burned down to their bases. On the shelf below stood a strange assortment of toys: a doll, too filthy for use, a pull toy that had lost almost all of its bright paint, and a coloring book propped upright as though it were an art display. Allie reached toward it gingerly as she pulled the cover back. The pages inside had been colored so thoroughly and so vigorously that she couldn't see a single inch of white paper. It was almost as though the owner had been over the same pages dozens of times. Even so, the coloring was crude, and in many cases, the artist hadn't even tried to stay within the lines. The final item on the shelf was a Polaroid camera. It reminded Allie of the camera she inherited from her grandfather. She thought she still had it in storage somewhere, though she hadn't seen it in years. Nausea was rising in Allie's stomach. photos were of her. Some showed her digging in her yard. That must have been months ago when I planted the garden. And others were of her leaving the house and locking the door behind herself. A final series, stuck in place of bride near the mattress's head, had been taken through her bedroom window and showed Allie asleep in her bed. In the closest photo, Allie wore the pajamas she'd purchased just a week previously. Allie's hand rose to cover her mouth. She turned toward the square of light in the plywood wall, her escape, and inhaled sharply. A person, or something that resembled a person, stood in the light. His face sagged strangely, as though his body had been sucked dry. His eyes bugged out of his head with a terrific intensity. Limp hair ran down to frame his cheeks, which housed an unnaturally large mouth. Then his mouth opened, splitting into a smile, as the batteries in Allie's light died. That one's spooky. Okay. I'm looking for the last one. Oh, here it is. This one is called Snow Hunting. Slow down, Ryan begged. Max's boots dug up clumps of snow as he forced his way over the hill. He stopped at its crest and planted his fists on his hips to survey the valley in front of him. Check this out. It's someone's holiday cabin. Ryan tried to keep up, though he had 40 kilos on Max and had become winded hours before. Despite the freezing temperatures, he was panting and sweating by the time he gained the hilltop. Good for them. Wanna have a poke around? What? Are you nuts? Ryan stared at his friend, whose acne-scarred face had the manic grin he wore whenever he was about to get them into trouble. Why not? It's obviously a vacation house, and they're not going to be living in it off-season. I don't want to get... Ryan trailed off, and Max laughed. Don't want to get arrested. Who by? The snow police. Come on, ain't nobody crazy enough to be around here. Except for us. Let's have a look inside the rich guy's house. It'll give us a break from hunting. Hunting had been Max's plan for that day. He'd taken his dad's gun and given Ryan a knife for the excursion. Ryan had been squeamish about the idea of gunning rabbits and deer, but after 4 hours of wildly off-the-mark shots and creating too much noise for them to have any hope of getting close to their prey, he was starting to think that he might not actually need to use the blade. Come on, Max said, then took off the other side of the hill in a windmill of waving limbs. Ryan sighed and followed at a more sedate pace, being careful not to slip in the thick drifts. His friend was already at the cabin's door when Max reached the foot of the hill. He didn't even lock it, Max yelled, shoving open the heavy wood door. He's basically asking for people to look through this stuff. What a moron. Hey, slow down, Ryan staggered after his friend, but hesitated on the house's threshold. The building looked expensive. You could imagine it belonging to one of the suited businessmen he sometimes saw picking up their children after school. He'd always envied those families. Their kids had the best backpacks and shoes, showed off the latest games the day after their release, and talked about flying to France or Bali for the holidays. That was, if he was honest with himself, the linchpin of his friendship with Max. They'd bonded over their hatred of the rich brats, as they called them. Max was erratic, loud, and pushy, but Ryan had to admit, Max had made him see and do a lot of stuff he otherwise wouldn't have. Stealing, skipping classes, going hunting. He sighed and entered the building. Max had dropped his backpack, gun, and gloves onto the wooden table that took up nearly half of the living room, and Ryan added his own backpack and knife to the pile. The room was large, richly furnished with fur and antlers, and surprisingly warm after the chill from the outside. He couldn't see his friend. Hey, Max. Max didn't reply for a moment, and when he did, his voice was strangely choked. Get in here. Ryan followed the voice down the corridor, leading them to the kitchen. A large freezer took up part of the room. collection of shelves covered the rest of the walls. It was clearly a hobby hunter's area to clean, prepare, and freeze the deer he'd shot. Max stood in front of one of the counters. His face had paled. Ryan approached him carefully and slapped his shoulder. "What's up?" "What does that look like to you?" Max asked. Ryan's stomach flipped as he turned to the marble counter. It was coated in dried blood and some sort of long fur. He's not good at cleaning up after himself, is he? Max carefully picked up one of the strands off the counter. He raised it to eye height. It would have been too thin to easily see except for the dried core stuck to it. "Ever seen an animal with hair this long?" he asked. Ryan hadn't. The strand was easily 40 centimeters. "What are you saying?" "This is hair." Max dropped the strand and stepped away from the counter. Ryan opened his mouth to disagree, but no counter-argument came to him. He raised his eyes from the blood-stained counter to look about the kitchen. It had all of the hallmarks of a hunter's home. Multiple blades hung from the hooks on the walls. Boxes of plastic bags and wrap lay nestled in the corner. And a large bin sat in the corner, and of course, there was the freezer. "Don't open that," Ryan said sharply, but Max ignored him. "Of course he won't listen to me. He never does." Max's face was blank as he raised the lid and stared at the box's contents. Ryan leaned forward, afraid of getting too close, but desperately curious to see inside. At least 24 plastic bags were arranged neatly in the deep freezer. Ryan saw a lot of flesh, but he couldn't even begin to guess what or where it had come from. He thought he saw pieces of skin that looked pink, though. Max reached into the box and picked up one of the bags. He dropped it immediately, but not before Ryan saw the woman's features inside. Her lips were tinged blue from the cold, her eyes frozen open in an expression of shock, her long hair painted red by the blood that had run from her severed neck. Ryan swore under his breath and grabbed Max's arm. "We've got to get out of here." For once, they were in perfect agreement. They scrambled down the hallway and back into the living room, where their equipment still waited for them on the table. Max froze partway across the room. Once again, he was struck by how much warmer the cabin was compared to the icy landscape. There's no way it should be this balmy. Not unless... He glanced toward the fireplace, where coals still glowed faintly in the grate. He tried to swallow, but his throat had tightened unbearably. "Where's my gun?" Max said, anger rushing into his voice, but not quite capable of masking his fear. "What did you do with it?" "Nothing." Ryan turned toward the table. Their backpacks and gloves were still scattered over the mahogany surface, but his knife was also missing. A piece of paper had been wedged under his backpack, though, and he pulled it free with shaking fingers. "I'm in the mood for some sport," the note read. "You have a 2-minute head start. Run." I will just stick with those 3 tonight. I thought they were pretty good. If you liked those, I can definitely read more stories from this book. Yeah, there's 50 in here or so, and I only read 3. Now that I'm older, I definitely prefer this over, like, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books, although those are just classic. I mean, you can't go wrong with them. They're nostalgic. They're campy, like, they're cute, spooky stories, like, but these are definitely more up my alley anymore, and I hope you enjoyed them. I would definitely be down to read more from this book. Let me know if you liked the stories. I want to read some more from Reddit soon too. Those are like my favorite because, like, the Let's Not Meet ones, the real ones, like, I love those. Alright. I hope you guys could relax. Thank you for joining me for tonight's video. And I will see you